My name is Gerald Van Belle. I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, as well as the Department of Biostatistics. I'll give you a little background about myself right now. I was born in the Netherlands, was born in 1936, lived in Holland till 1949, so I lived through the Second World War, which could lead to war stories, but I won't bother you with that. And then in 1949 we immigrated to Canada, to Ontario, Canada, and moved to the Manitoulin Island, which is the largest freshwater island in the world, I believe. It's in Lake Huron. One of the remarkable things about that trip was that we lived in a city in Holland, in the eastern part of Holland, a rather large city. My father was a florist, and he started to work for a farmer who had a nursery as well as a garden center. And so we got to Chicoinda, that was the name of the place, and we were driven to a house about a mile from the next house. No water, no electricity, and no plumbing. And that's how we spent our first year in Canada. And my mother had to learn how to cook bread on a wood stove, and the first few times the bread wasn't very good, I can assure you. And then in 1949, in 1950 rather, we went to southern Ontario, and my dad and family moved there to again get involved with landscaping and so on. I went to Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for 3 years, from 1953 to 1956, and then in 56 I was in the pre-engineering program at Calvin College. I went to the University of Michigan to do pre-engineering, and unfortunately I didn't do very well, and so I left after the first year and went back to Canada and to Bowmanville, Ontario, and took a job in General Motors, working on the line, putting back seats in cars. So that was a good way to learn the value of education. And after a year, I got a job at helping a faculty member at the University of Toronto, who was a biostatistician, in fact. And so my first real job, professional job, was working with this gentleman to carry out assays of insulin and polio vaccine that Connaught Medical Research Laboratories, as they say in Canada, was making at that time. And my job was to help him do the calculations for the assays of for insulin and polio vaccine and so on. And so that's where I got my first taste of biostatistics. I was actually doing biostatistics without really knowing anything about it. I then went to school in the evening, and in 1962 I finally got my BA, and then went back to school full-time. And one reason I think that I did wind up doing reasonably well in my life was that I met my wife in 1959, and we were married in 1963, and if anybody is responsible for my success in life, it would be my wife, Johanna. We were married in 63, got my master's degree in mathematical statistics at the University of Toronto in 64, and in 67 I got my PhD. We then immigrated to Florida State University in Tallahassee. It seemed very romantic and exciting to move from a snowy climate to a hot and humid climate, and we were in Tallahassee for 7 years. We were there from 1967 to 1974. I was a faculty member in the Department of Statistics and did a lot of work with people from biology and ecology, so I've had a long-time interest in biology and environmental studies already going back to those days. In 1973, I believe it was, we were interviewing for a faculty member to come to Florida State, and we interviewed a fellow named Lloyd Fisher. And Lloyd Fisher came down with his wife, Jenny, and interviewed for a job at Florida State University. He made a terrific impression on me, and we offered him a job, and he turned it down. And Lloyd was a faculty member in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Washington. So in 1974, I was due for a sabbatical, having worked at Florida State for 7 years. So I wrote Lloyd a note saying any opportunities for doing a sabbatical at the University of Washington. And he wrote back, I said, well, I talked with my chair, Donovan Thompson, and we'd actually like you to come and visit us for a year and show us how to do consulting, because I was in charge of a consulting center at Florida State University in the Department of Statistics, and Lloyd had sort of liked that. So I agreed to come to the University of Washington in Seattle and to do some statistical consulting with the various people that were coming through the School of Public Health and the Department of Biostatistics. So we came in the autumn of 1974 to Seattle. Lloyd and Jenny found us a house on Northgate Way, which we rented for a year. And we sent our children to a private Christian school up here, right here up on 145th and 25th. And we liked it here immediately. We liked the department, we liked the church, we liked the school. And by about October, we said, we're not going back. And we decided that we would stay here in Seattle. Well, I had no job beyond the visiting appointment for a year, so I was ready to basically start my own consulting firm if there was no job available for me. Well, fortunately, there was an opening in the Department of Biostatistics that came up that year. I was one of the candidates. They flew in a whole bunch of people, most of whom were a lot smarter than I was, I thought. But in the end, they offered me the job. And so in 1975, I came here as a regular faculty member. We called a real estate company in Tallahassee and said, please move all of our stuff, and because we're not coming back. So we didn't even go back to Tallahassee. The real estate company hired a mover, and one of the funny stories about the moving is that the moving company came in and just moved everything. So in the garage we had empty paint cans. Well, when they got here, the truck was loaded with empty paint cans. We had some work done by a contractor in our house in Tallahassee, and we hadn't been too happy with the contractor, and he was still working on it when we left, in fact. And in fact, when we heard later on that he had a very expensive wheelbarrow, one of these heavy-duty wheelbarrows that happened to be standing on the lawn still when we had told the mover to come and pick everything up. And so lo and behold, we got this very wonderful heavy-duty wheelbarrow, came out all the way from Tallahassee, and we still have it today. It's a very strong wheelbarrow. So again, that happened to come because of the fact that we didn't have any oversight at all as to what we should be moving. So in 75, we bought this house where you're in right now, and we've been in this house ever since. We've remodeled it a lot since that time because it was kind of an ugly house. It still is an ugly house, but it was very livable because we had a fairly large family by that time. We had 4 children, and a 5th one was born in 1979. So at that time, we became concerned about the world population expansion, and we stopped at 5. Of course, we have 8 grandchildren, so we're probably contributing a little bit to the world's overpopulation. My wife is a physician. She graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in medicine, and practiced medicine in Florida. And then when we came here and decided to stay here, she had to pass her board exams, and so she did that in 1975, and she started to work for the Hall Health Primary Care Center on campus, and she worked there for 29 years. She retired in 2004 from working at the Hall Health Center, but she worked there for a long time, and we always tried to manage to raise the children together by having both her take care of them and me, but I must say she probably did the lion's share of the work. One thing I liked about the Department of Biostatistics was that it was a very collegial department. It was smaller than the statistics department that I was in at Florida State University. The other thing that excited me about this was that I think I'd always enjoyed working with real-life problems and real-life challenges, particularly in medicine or the health sciences, whatever you want to call it. And so I was immediately taken by the seriousness of the work, by the colleagues, and then, of course, you've already heard a lot about Donovan Thompson. He was a leader and a cheerleader. I think that he was able to energize people. He never had an axe to grind. He always backed you up, and he was just a great person to model. And he was very open. In one of the earlier interviews, it was already mentioned that even things like faculty salaries were he'd put out a spreadsheet and all the faculty salaries would be displayed there. So that certainly was a model for me, and in part because that probably resonated with my own sense of values and my own ideas about how you treat other people, and particularly people who maybe not quite as senior as you are. So, and that goes particularly for staff. And I may say something about that when I talk about the Department of Environmental Health. So for the first couple of years, I did consulting. A lot of people came through my door with statistical problems, and as usually happens is that if they like to work with you, then they put you on a grant. And so once you get on a grant, then you have a certain amount of time committed to that grant, and so your available time for other consulting goes down and down and down. And before you know it, the thing that you're supposed to be doing is no longer possible because you're committed 100% to grants that you've been involved or that you're involved with. So I got involved with the health rooms at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center fairly quickly, and did some interesting work there, but on the whole I was not too interested in cancer, and so I basically sort of backed out of that to work on some other stuff. One of my first big challenges was to work on a project involving crib death, or sudden infant death syndrome, and this came through my contacts with Don Peterson, who was the chair of the Department of Epidemiology. Don, unfortunately, is dead, and he died 8 or 10 years ago, very suddenly, of pancreatic cancer. But he and I hit it off. We both have a little bit of a humorous streak, I think. We both tend to be a little bit philosophical, and so he and I would meet once a week, and he'd present me with his problem of the week in terms of statistics. And he had been very interested in crib death. In fact, he was involved with the coining of the acronym Sudden Infant Death Syndrome back in the 1960s with a pathologist at Children's Hospital named Bruce Beckwith. So there was a call for a large nationwide epidemiological study of crib death involving something like 1,000. The aim was to collect 1,000 cases of crib death, and then to get 1,000 controls, and then to compare the cases and the controls in the usual case control pattern. So we competed for the data coordinating center for that study, and I got it, and I was basically the PI. And so Don and I spent many years from I think 1977 to 1984 or so to work on the crib death study. I assembled an office with a team of people for data entry, data analysis, and so on, and went to Washington about once every 3 months to meet with the sponsors of the study from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. At that time, I also met Irv Emanuel, because he was interested in children's health, and he and I worked together off and on, not so much in terms of research, but I think there were at least 3 PhD students that he had, where I was the obvious candidate for the statistical representative, and so I spent a lot of time with Irv examining students for their qualifying exams and for their comprehensive exams. That project finished in 1984, less satisfactory than I'd hoped, but the only thing that we could show was that smoking was a big risk factor for crib death, and so suggesting some kind of environmental component, but most of the other leads were pretty minimal, and it was one example of where a lot of money was spent on a project, and the bottom line still is that you say, well, was it worth spending all that money on this particular project? What do we know now that we didn't know before the project started? In 1983, George Martin, a faculty member in pathology, put in an application for an Alzheimer's disease research center. And as I mentioned, I was just finishing with the project on crib death, so it seemed very interesting and very natural to go to the other end of the lifespan and to work with George Martin on this application for the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And that was funded. And so in 83, we got that center going, and I was in charge of the data management, biostatistics, and epidemiology core. Every center has a core which provides both the services as well as guidance to the researchers in terms of the design of experiments, analysis of the data, presentation of the results, and so on and so forth. So in 83, George Martin, as I mentioned, got the grant, and I became the director of that center of the core, the biostatistics core, and that was a very fruitful collaboration. And I just stepped down from heading that core when I retired in 2005. So I worked with George and Murray Raskant, subsequently the director of the center for more than 20 years. So Alzheimer's has been a continuing interest of mine, but not the only one, because I was also interested in environmental studies.
Gerald, please tell us about your work with Nancy Temkin and epilepsy.
Nancy Temkin was a person that we hired in the late 70s to help us with statistical work, and she became interested in epilepsy and the epilepsy center at Harborview Medical Center, and Nancy and I hit it off, and so I decided I would join the epilepsy center as well. So for many years, Nancy and I worked together at the epilepsy center. And one of the things that led to that was that the Food and Drug Administration was trying to develop new drugs, as well as the Epilepsy Branch of the National Institutes of Health. And so because of that, I was asked to join one of the committees at the National Institutes of Health, the Epilepsy Branch, which looked at candidate drugs for possible treatment of epilepsy. In the 1980s, there was only one drug, kind of a standard drug for epilepsy, called phenytoin, and epilepsy was considered one of these orphan diseases, in the sense that it was not, the pharmaceutical firms just didn't think that there was enough money to developing drugs because the market would be too small. So the government came up with the idea that if the pharmaceutical firms would identify candidate drugs, they would do some of the animal testing, the government would do some of the animal testing, which was very expensive, and then the pharmaceutical firms, if drugs were identified in the animal test that were reasonable, then the pharmaceutical firms would take over and do the actual clinical testing. So the epilepsy branch had a committee to review these candidate drugs, and they invited me to join that committee. And it was a fascinating committee, because what happened there was there were a variety of people on there. There were toxicologists. The most interesting person were the people who were what are called medicinal chemists. They could look at a molecule, a technical molecule for a candidate drug, and they would be able to tell you, well, this molecule looks like this, so it's going to act like this. And so the idea was that out of hundreds of candidate molecules or drugs that could be thought about for epilepsy, to narrow it down to a smaller group, which then would go into animal testing. And it was a kind of an exercise in the crystal ball gazing and seat of the pants science, and not always successful, because as usual, one of my rules is that if a drug works, there are going to be side effects. Some of the medicines that we did recommend for further animal testing turned out to be very effective, but also if you gave a dose that was just a little too high, it became very toxic. So there was a rather bad profile. So it was really fun to work with that group and to talk about that. And because of that exposure, the FDA invited me to come and join one of their advisory committees, the Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drug Advisory Committee, which was the committee that dealt with basically with drugs that affect the peripheral and central nervous system, so i.e. Drugs for epilepsy, drugs for Alzheimer's, any drugs that affect the central nervous system. And I served on that committee for 2 terms, and it was always a very interesting experience to go to Washington and to sit in a huge room with 200 or 300 people present, 3 very large TV cameras in the back of the room. Turned out the TV cameras were manned or staffed by commercial interests, because what they would do is they would videotape the whole conference and then sell the tape to a pharmaceutical firm, because that's how the pharmaceutical firm could find out how a committee of the FDA reviews drugs. And so the pharmaceutical industry buys these tapes, and I know from personal experience that they spend a lot of money investigating the wishes and the interests of the committee members that review these drugs. So it all looks very innocuous at the surface, but it's a very intense operation, and in part because a lot of money is involved. I've actually been at the other end of this. I'm at the other end of that right now, where I'm doing some consulting work for a pharmaceutical firm, where they're asking me to come to Washington to be on a mock FDA panel. So I represent the FDA panel in this review, and I've done this 3 or 4 times now, where the company basically goes through a simulated run of the presentation that they'll make to the FDA, and the mock panel tries to knock as many holes in the presentation as possible, because that's the way they can anticipate what the questions are. And it's not uncommon for the pharmaceutical company to bring a staff of 15 or 20 people to these hearings, who all have a very specialized role in the presentation. It's almost like a ballet dance. So, for example, they may have, in their presentation, they may show 30 slides. They'll have a backlog of 3,000 or 4,000 slides that they actually have indexed as to various topics. So as soon as somebody from the committee raises a question, somebody says, bring up slide number 1638, and they produce slide 1638 and show the committee whatever the answer is to the committee's questions. So that's a long story, but I've always enjoyed those meetings, those hearings, and I may go to one next month, in fact. They're challenging because you really have to know what you're talking about. There's nothing like having somebody say something on a committee and you know that that's baloney, and somebody's going to pick that up fairly quickly. If the FDA doesn't pick it up, the pharmaceutical firm will pick it up. So you have to be wise, you have to understand what you're doing, and you have to understand what the key issues are. I think the Biostatistics department at the University of Washington has contributed more members to FDA advisory committees than any other university. So people like Lloyd Fisher, Tom Fleming, and others are staple members of these advisory committees. Nancy Temkin is another one. All these people serve on it, and then there's almost seems to be at least one spot on these committees for a University of Washington biostatistics faculty member. And I've really enjoyed these things. It's, as I said, it's challenging, it's fun, and you really have to be on your toes. So that brings us up to about the mid-'80s, and in terms of departmental things, Donovan Thompson stepped down in '82, I believe, and we can check that date. And I think that Paulie Feigl was acting chair for a year, and then Norm Breslow became chair. He was appointed as chair by Gil Oman, and I'll get back to Gil Oman later on. I was involved with the educational program in the Biostatistics department. At that time, the degree-granting authority resided in something called the Biomathematics Group. So technically, the department didn't have a degree-granting authority, but it was a Biomathematics Group, which was a group in the graduate school. These are all administrative kind of details that are not too important, except if you're dealing with them as an administration, then it becomes quite time-consuming to sort that all out. And so in the mid-'80s, we managed to get degree-granting authority within the department itself, and the Biomathematics Group basically became a smaller group associated with the College of Fisheries and the College of Forestry. So, in fact, I was the last director of the program. When the program died, I basically stepped down as chair of the Biomathematics Group. I continued work on Alzheimer's in the '80s, worked with other people as well in a variety of other areas. And then in 1990, I heard to my dismay that the chair of the Department of Environmental Health, Sheldon Murphy, had died from lung cancer at age 59. And it was quite a shock. I'd seen him in the elevators once in a while and getting balder and balder because of his the therapy that he was getting, the chemotherapy and so on. And he succumbed to the disease at the age of 59. One interesting thing that in fact, I gave a lecture yesterday in one of the biostat classes. I said how we are driven to look for causes as human beings, and whether that's put into us by evolution or what, I really don't know. But as soon as we have an effect, we look for a cause. So I said to the students, yesterday, Sheldon Murphy, age 59, died of lung cancer. What's the first thought that comes to your mind? And the students say, did he smoke? And they said, you didn't ask, did he have a wife? Was he married? But you asked, did he smoke? And so we're kind of hardwired to look for causes. And in his case, he had smoked apparently at a younger age, but he hadn't really smoked lately. So, but anyway, it was clear that there was some link to smoking. But that's an interesting side about the human condition. Looking for causes, and I think that biostatistics is one of the fields that shows us how we can actually determine cause and effect. And biostatisticians spend a lot of time thinking carefully about how to show cause-effect, and also how to deduce cause from effect. And that's not easy, and there are a whole group of models called causal models that we deal with, and we have some experts in the department that are expert on causal models, how to disentangle the causes from the effects and so on. At any rate, in 1990, Sheldon Murphy died, and I was flabbergasted to get a call from the dean, Gilman, immediately after that, asking me if I would become the interim chair for the Department of Environmental Health. After all, I'm just a statistician. I just work with numbers. But apparently the faculty of the department and people like Dave Eaton I'd done some work with them in the 80s, had decided that they sort of liked my administrative style. I don't know exactly where they'd gotten that from, but Gil asked me if I would be interested in becoming the interim chair. And I said, well, I have to talk about it with my wife. And so we talked about it and thought about it, and then I said, yeah, I'm ready for a change. It took real sacrifice because I had a beautiful office up on the 6th floor where I could see Mount Rainier, and this meant going down to the 4th floor where all you saw was the South Campus Center building. So it was, it was in some sense coming down in life rather than going up. I joined the Department of Environmental Health at that time. And, of course, I wasn't even a faculty member there, so they had to make me a faculty member in environmental health. So in 1990, I was appointed as professor of environmental health as well, and went downstairs and took over the office of Sheldon Murphy. And the office was a mess. Murphy was a pack rat, and there were just boxes all over the place and so on and so forth. And so I despaired of getting anything done at all in that office. The fortunate thing was the administrator of the department, Gene Garber, was just brilliant, and Secretary Sue Golicki was equally good. They kept me honest. They knew where the skeletons were, as it were, and so they could point to me the issues, and there were lots of issues when I got there. There was a lawsuit hanging over the department that had to be dealt with, as well as other things. Another interesting story is that Gil said, oh, by the way, since you're going to be the interim chair, why don't you become the chair of the search committee as well? I said, well, okay, so if that has to be done, that has to be done. So I became the chair of the search committee. We sent out ads to the various journals and all over the country and got a whole series of applicants for the position of chair of environmental health. About December or so, people said to me, hey, we like the way you run things. Why don't you become a candidate? I said, how can I become a candidate? I'm chair of the search committee. So I said, that just is not reasonable. So in May of 91, we had a candidate, I won't mention his name, who accepted the job as chair of environmental health. And we sent his name to the president, and the president approved. And the candidate came down for another orientation interview late in May, and was there for 3 days. And I showed him all the department, all the things that were going on, and so on and so forth. On Saturday, we got an email from him saying that he thought about the fact that life was short, his biological clock was ticking, and he respectfully declined the job of chair of environmental health. So here we were done. We had two candidates. He was number one. So then Gil said to me, why don't you become a candidate for chair after all? So I said, well, I felt I'd done my job. I'd delivered a candidate who signed and then turned down the job. I said, okay, so I resigned as chair of the search committee, and a month later I was the chair of the department, the permanent chair of the department. So, and it was a great place. Department of Environmental Health was different from the other departments, and I think that's one thing that I liked about it already. First of all, there was an undergraduate program, and it turned out that that was an issue because the undergraduate program hadn't been doing that well. Gil, I'll talk about Gil in a minute, Gil really pushed research. He wanted the school to move from a service-oriented kind of organization to just a research organization. And he wanted research, he wanted grants. He felt that the only way that we could survive was to get lots of grants, get lots of money from outside the state because we weren't going to get it from the state. So that was one thing. The department had an undergraduate program. The other interesting thing was the department had a unique obligation to the state. In 1963, the Washington State Legislature wanted to have some presence in occupational medicine and environmental health in the state. And the industry didn't want it in government. And labor didn't want it in industry. And so these two were at each other. So the final upshot of it was that they said, why don't we sponsor a unit at the University of Washington? So in 1963, the state passed legislation establishing an environmental health research laboratory at the University of Washington. And that ultimately became the Department of Environmental Health. Well, show me the money. Where does the money come from? Well, it turns out there is something called the Accident and Medical Aid Funds. These are two funds that are administered by the state to insure workers that get injured. And there's one fund that only is contributed by industry, but the other fund, there is a contribution by both labor and industry. And that's one reason that both labor and industry had some say about where the research facility would be located. So that became the Department of Environmental Health, and that became a fairly important source of money. I mean, you're talking real money, $2 or $3 million a year. And of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So the state expected, to get resources from the department in terms of any occupational environmental health issues that would be of interest to the state. The department was expected to contribute research and information. The department was expected to establish a continuing education program. And so these were very important. And one of the things that I did when I became chair was to make that a very high priority, to keep our relationships with the state and the sponsors as open and as congenial as possible. One interesting aspect of that legislation also was that the legislation appointed an advisory committee, and the advisory committee was to supervise the department. And the advisory committee consisted of the following people. One is the Secretary of Health of the State Department of Health. Another one was, and these were all named, but not by name but by function, the Dean of the College of Engineering, the President of the Association of Washington Business, the President of the AFL-CIO Washington. There were one or two more people that were involved. I've forgotten exactly who they were. And then the chair of the Department of Environmental Health was to chair this august body. Oh, of course, the other person was the director of the Department of Labor and Industries. So here I was, not knowing anything about occupational health, first of all, and secondly, having to chair this meeting. So it was always a very traumatic experience initially to go to Olympia, to the Department of Labor and Industries, and sit in this room with all these very important people, including my boss, Gilman, who was also a member of the committee, and to chair this committee. So Gene Garber, Gilman, and I would typically drive, and Sue Golicki would typically drive to Olympia, discuss all the fine points to be discussed for that particular quarterly meeting, and then hope that we would come out with money and not too many criticisms. And on the whole, it worked pretty well. We were able to actually increase support from the Department of Labor and Industries over the years fairly substantially due to identifying problems that were outside the realm and so on. So I think that certainly during my tenure, and I think Dave Coleman as well, we've had a very good relationship with the Department of Labor and Industries, even though there have been attempts to basically get rid of the program. There was a fairly serious attempts 3 or 4 years ago when the state had this had a great shortfall in terms of income, and there was a drive by some parties to get rid of the whole program at the University of Washington, as funded by the Accident and Medical Aid Fund. I think that push has not succeeded. Well, I know it has not succeeded, but I don't think there's any current pressure on us for that. But that was another reason that this was a very unique department. Another unique feature of the department was its breadth. So there were 4 programs beside the undergraduate program, actually 5. There was the occupational medicine program, there was toxicology. Sheldon Murphy was a toxicologist, and so he had sort of 2 roles as head of the toxicology program and as chair of the department. There was industrial hygiene, and then there was environmental health technology, which dealt with things like water quality and waste management and so on. So one of the things that I did when I became chair is I decided not to identify myself with any one of those 4 groups, so that nobody could say that I favored one group over the other. So I later on, after I stepped down as chair, I joined the environmental health technology group as the most reasonable one in terms of my interests. But at the time, I decided that I wouldn't join any of those groups, and so nobody could say that I was favoring one program over the other, because I think there was a little bit of a perception that toxicology had benefited from the fact that the chair also was a toxicologist. I'm not too sure about that. One more thing that the department had, there was an extended degree program at Hanford for the radiological sciences. So we had faculty over at Hanford. Well, how do you supervise faculty that work for another entity? They typically worked for one of the Hanford contractors. How do you supervise those faculty, and how do you supervise students that are going through the program over there? So that was a bit of a headache, how to deal with that as well. So that turned out to be solved by the state fortuitously, in some sense, in that in the mid-'90s, the state, in its wisdom, decided that the extended degree program at Hanford would, in fact, become the responsibility of Washington State University. So I spent a lot of time transitioning that program, visiting the dean at Hanford, the dean of the Washington State Branch at Richland, a fellow by the name of Cochran, nice fellow. And but we basically had to make sure that we transitioned this in an appropriate way. How do you do that with students that weren't quite finished yet? So there were all kinds of little administrative wrinkles that had to be dealt with. Oh, and then, of course, the biggest thing that landed on my plate was space. The space is the coin of the realm, space and parking. If you want to get faculty upset within the university, just talk about space or parking, and take either one away and you're in trouble. So parking was okay, but space with a growing department just wasn't available. We were landlocked, and so the university, as part of the deal that I got as becoming chair, gave me a hunting license, basically meaning that they said, well, you go and find some space, and we'll bless it. Well, thank you for nothing. The first couple of years, I spent a lot of time with Gene Garber and Sue and other faculty members walking around all the way from the south end of Lake Union to Northgate, looking at space that could be used for departmental space. One of the problems was we needed laboratory space, and laboratory space is not like simply taking an office space and then putting in some pipettes. That just doesn't generate laboratory space. Laboratory space is very expensive, and it just wasn't to be had. So we actually had contractors come in with proposals for buildings that they would build just a little bit north of the current Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. We actually had a building online that they were going to convert to us at some extreme cost. And, of course, the university was very nice to give us this hunting license, but the bottom line still was that we had to come up with the money. And where was that money going to come from? Well, we didn't have a cash cow, so the money would typically have to come out of grants and contracts. So you're talking about taking the indirect costs that university levels, and then hope that that can be leveraged somehow or other into money for buildings. So it turned out that the solution was a little bit closer to hand because Zymogenetics had a lot of space on Roosevelt Avenue, 4225 Roosevelt Avenue, right where 42nd Avenue runs dead into Roosevelt. And they were going to buy the old steam plant down by Lake Union, the building with the 3 or 4 chimneys up on top. And so they were willing to sublet. They had leased this a lot of space in Roosevelt. They were willing to sublet it to us for the time being, and then as soon as they moved out, we would basically take over the lease. So we looked into that, and it just seemed to fit, so that before we were done, we were able to rent that space. And then we got another piece of space down there by the Aurora Bridge. There's actually one of the faculty members from the Department of Environmental Health has a lot of space there, where we just rented a building and converted that to a dry lab, basically. And so that space is there too. But you sort of say, well, where did I get instructions in my graduate program about renting space as a faculty member? And the answer is, well, you just go by the seat of your pants. And it was kind of amazing at the time that the university was as laissez-faire with respect to this. As long as we could identify the space, as long as we could pay for it, they'd say, you have our blessing. So that did work out. But it took an inordinate amount of time, and it wasn't until about 95 or so that we had firmly established the department presence on 4225 Roosevelt. And of course now we have a lot more space there, and in fact a good part of the department has been moved to the Roosevelt building. It splits the department, which is unfortunate, because I do think that it's very important to have opportunity to talk to each other in the hallway and to come up with new ideas. I always find if I meet somebody in the hall, we're always coming up with some idea about something or another, and if the hallways are a mile apart, you just can't do that. So that was one of the unfortunate aspects, I think, of that move. But the other option was just to stay where we were, and then that means that we could not recruit faculty and we could not come up with space for them nor equipment, and that would not have been consistent with our mission.
Why don't you tell us something about Donovan?
Donovan, not many people know it, had only one eye. He had some kind of disease in his eye when he was in the Army, I believe, and they didn't look at it quickly enough or carefully enough so that by the time they looked at it, he went blind in one eye. But he was still a great golfer. And I asked him, how can you judge distances? Because distances have to be judged bifocally. So how can you do that? Well, he had some way of doing that. And I don't remember his answer, but he clearly was a good golfer. So the one eye did not deter him from being a good golfer. The other thing was that even the good eye wasn't very good. And I remember we were in Vancouver for a meeting, and he drove up with us. So he had this nice Thunderbird, nice big Thunderbird car. We went to some meeting at the University of British Columbia or something like that. And we came back, and it was dark. It was raining. And Donovan said to me, he said, I really shouldn't be driving at this time of the night with only one eye. Would you mind driving? So I drove back from Vancouver for Donovan because he was blind as a bat almost in one eye. But that's a Donovan story. Another Donovan story is that we used to have lunch at the South Campus Center, and the office, the Biostatistics department is up on the 6th floor of the F wing. And so Donovan used to walk up the stairs 2 steps at a time as a way of getting his exercise. That was his way of showing that he was still in pretty good shape, even though he was mid-60s already. I still remember him tromping up from -1 up to the 6th floor, and just in great shape. One story relates back to my days when I was the head of the coordinating center for the SIDS study. That was a very hard study. because I didn't always see eye to eye with the supervisory staff. First of all, this was a contract, not a grant. With a grant, I don't know, you probably don't know the distinction. There are three levels. There's a contract, basically says the government wants a truck and it has to be yellow. And if you think you're going to paint it red, you're wrong, because they want a yellow truck. A cooperative agreement is the next level up, where they'll say, well, let's talk about it. Maybe we should make it brown. So at least there's some discussion as to whether the truck is going to be brown or not. And a grant is they tell you, here's money for a truck, but you can go out and get a Humvee, so it doesn't really matter. So this contract, this arrangement with NICHD was a contract. That means that they had complete control over anything that had to go. And so they weren't too happy with some of the decisions that I'd made, and I still remember two of the supervisors from NICHD came over and tromped into Donovan's office to complain about me. I wasn't there, of course, because they wanted to have a private conversation with Donovan. And Donovan said something like this to them: Gerald knows what he's doing. If you have problems with Gerald, you want to talk with Gerald. And so always backed me. And then the other funny Donovan story is that Donovan got into an argument with somebody. I don't know exactly what the issue was about. And so he came to me one day and said, well, the three of us should talk. He wanted me in on this discussion. Not that it involved me, but he wanted to have somebody else sort of hear his side of the story. And so he came in with this person. And this happened to be the day that you could take your son or your daughter to work. So I happened to have my son with me, my oldest son, Will, and he sat in the office while Donovan and this person came in, and they started to argue fairly heatedly, and they kind of got mad at each other. Anyway, it got resolved ultimately, and that night when I got home, my son said to me, Dad, I don't know what you do, but when people get to your office, they always get mad. And so somehow or other he associated that I was responsible for them getting mad and angry, and in point of fact, of course, it was just so that Donovan had happened to pick that up or wanted to talk with me at that time.
Tell us now, if you would, about Gilman.
Interesting fellow. Probably the hardest working person I've ever met. There are many Gilman stories. One of them is that the university in the early 90s, mid-90s, when email was just starting up, would shut down their system at 4 o'clock in the morning to retape or retool whatever they did, or clean out the memory banks. I don't know exactly what they did, until they got this irritating letter from this dean, Gilman, who complained that he couldn't do his email at 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, that's Gil. I think that he probably slept 3 hours a night, and then he'd go off and do his email, and so he thought 4 o'clock was just the perfect time to do email, and here the system was down. So he was not amused. And when Gil was not amused, you would hear about it. Anyway, Gil came in 1982 as chairman of the Department of Environmental Health. My predecessor, in fact, my ultimate predecessor. He was chair for about 6 months, and then they promoted him to dean. But his appointment was in the Department of Environmental Health. So when I became acting chair, interim chair in 1990, and I had to chair faculty meetings, Gil would come in and sit in the faculty meetings, which was kind of awkward, because here Gil was then my employee as member of the department, but he was also my boss as dean. And you could sort of tell the ambiance of the faculty meeting just changed. As soon as Gil walked in, the people who were very chatty would become very less chatty. And it was clear that Gil initially was sort of trying to figure out, is this guy going to be good as a chair or not? Because, he really wanted to know that. So after about 3 or 4 meetings, I think he sort of put enough trust in me, and so he basically wouldn't show up anymore. He just wouldn't come to the faculty meetings anymore, except occasionally if he had to report something as a dean. And the faculty, I think, on the whole, was very happy with that, and which I think is reasonable enough, because it's kind of awkward for the dean to kind of come in and then not act like a dean, but act like a faculty member. I mean, how do you do that? And that would be especially hard to do for Gil. And Gil was a hard driver, as I said. He still is a hard driver. He always backed me. He respected argument. If you didn't agree with him, you had to say so. You shouldn't mope. You should simply say, Gil, I don't agree. And most of the time he'd buy your argument. He'd say, well, I don't think that's as important as you say it is, but that's fine. So I never felt that he was second-guessing me. I never felt that he was sort of judging me in terms of saying, well, gee, you did something that I wouldn't have done. He was very supportive, and I really felt that I had a good boss. He always took care of me. One of the rules that I had when I was both a faculty member and as chair, I always told the chair, my salary is your responsibility. I shouldn't have to argue for my salary. You'd make a judgment as to what I'm worth. And when I became chair, I said to Gil, that's your problem. You figure out what I'm worth. You know what the other chairs make. I could find that out anyway. But you determine what my salary is. And Gil was very fair and very generous. So I had no problem with that. And furthermore, Gil was a person with an outward vision. He was always running around. He was not in the office very much. And that's where Pat Wall, as associate dean, just played a sterling role. One analogy is that I have is sort of the president of the university and the provost. The president is kind of the outward person, linkage with the community, issues of fundraising and so on, and the provost is the chief academic officer. Well, in some sense, that's exactly how Pat and Gil worked. Pat was kind of the chief academic officer, so anything relating to the educational program, anything relating to the internal aspects of the school was Pat's domain, and Gil should have been so lucky. Pat was just superb. Gil was very much, as I mentioned, outward looking. He was the person who was always on a plane going from somewhere to somewhere. And it was fortunate that he had people like Pat Wall to stay behind and take care of the day-to-day work. And I think that Pat was a great support to him during the years that he was dean. And on the other hand, I think Gil was a great model for Pat in terms of scientific integrity and dealing with important scientific questions, so that Pat, when she became dean, certainly had the ideal that Gil had, and was able to perhaps give a little bit more of a personal touch to it by staying closer to home and dealing with issues that would be of use to the school, to the immediate school. So I think some of the things that she's done, such as the founder luncheons and, in fact, this project, indicate her sense of not only looking backwards, but also and a way of keeping the memories going, but also a way of looking forward. And, of course, guess what? The biggest challenge that Pat has right now is space. And we're talking as a school for a new building or perhaps relocating somewhere. And so in that sense, nothing's new. When I first came in 1974, space was an issue, and space is an issue today. And I think that the University of Washington, just being what it is, space is always going to be an issue. One of the things that Gil told me when I became chair is that he wanted me to have more national visibility. I'm a very modest person in many ways, and so I hadn't gone out to beat the bush for myself, and I still don't do that. In fact, this is where Gil was my champion again. So Gil nominated me for membership on the research committee of the Health Effects Institute. And I served there for 8 years. Did my 2 terms, This is an institute located in Boston, and they're a very interesting institute. I could spend an hour just talking about the Health Effects Institute, but it's basically a non-government organization which gets funding from the EPA and the automobile industry to investigate the health effects of air pollution. So that's the Health Effects Institute, and I was on the research committee for 8 years, learned a tremendous amount about issues relating air pollution to health. Well, I got on that board because Gil nominated me, and he had enough clout that it carried the day. Another committee he got me on was the BEST, the Board of Environmental Studies and Toxicology of the National Research Council. And I served there for one term, and they deal with a lot of the research questions generated by the federal government relating to basically environmental studies and toxicology. And again, Gil was the one that basically pushed my name through, I'm sure. And so I served there. So there were other things that I did in my tenure as chair which were kind of outside of my comfort zone. For example, there was there was something called the Association of University Programs in Occupational Health and Safety. And this was basically a group that of people, of physicians primarily. There were occupational physicians that dealt with occupational health. This was a kind of an informal lobbying group. We would meet in Washington every 6 months, and we'd have our meeting to talk about occupational health and safety, and then we'd split and go and visit the Hill, as they say. So I dutifully go to offices of Slade Gordon and all the other people that were there, Patty Murray, McDermott, and whoever else was there to talk about occupational health and safety. In fact, I ultimately wound up becoming the president of that organization for a couple of years, and again, for a lowly biostatistician to become the president of that kind of an outfit was sort of interesting, and I really enjoyed doing that, but it was not the sort of thing that I would have learned in graduate school. So, and that was all due to Gil sort of saying, well, the department has to become visible, and you're the chair, therefore you better go out and preach about the department. And there were other groups that I wound up on, that I'm still on, in fact, today, and primarily because Gil was the one that pushed me and prodded me to get out and make the department visible. In fact, when my 5-year review came up as chair, there was one criticism of the review committee that they heard from the faculty, was that I spent too much time traveling on behalf of the department, which was kind of ironic because that's exactly what Gil had told me to do, and I took it with a little bit of a grain of salt. I think I was still minding the store at home, but no doubt I could have spent more time at the office, but I didn't do that at the time. So in 1998, I decided that it was time to step down as chair and to just go back to becoming a regular faculty member. And of course, this was, I think I walked into Gil's office sometime in August and told him that I wanted to be out of the chairmanship the following year, just to give him enough of lead time. And then 3 months later, Gil was gone to the University of Michigan as vice president for medical affairs. So things changed rather rapidly. Dave Coleman became the chair after me. He was my associate chair, and I think Dave has done a very good job minding the store and taking care of things, and he and I continue to meet occasionally to work actually on one research project, and then to also just to talk about how the department is going. In terms of my own scholarly work, I'm very much an applied statistician. What turns me on are practical problems. I'm not a theory person. I like to look at the theory once I know the practical issue, but I'm not the person that sort of develops a theorem and then looks for some kind of an application. Most of the time it's the other way around. So Lloyd Fisher and I worked on this book on biostatistics for a long time during the late 80s. And we had a publisher, Wiley, and when all was said and done, the book turned out to be 1,000 pages long. And Wiley said, "Oh, well, sorry, we're interested in the book, but not in a book that big." So we then tried to shop around for other publishers, but couldn't find one until we decided that what we'd do is we'd do our own typesetting and then see what would happen. Well, Wiley said, once we said that we were doing our own typesetting, Wiley said, well, we're interested. So they wound up publishing the book, and they've done very well by the book. It came out in 1993, and we've done very well by the book too. And we published a second edition in 2004, and we recruited two other additional authors, Patrick Haggerty and Thomas Lumley, and we switched the role of the authors. And this was one of the 2 times in my life that I've been unlucky in gambling, but therefore perhaps lucky in love. In the late 1970s, I worked on a paper with a fellow named Joe Brown from the Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and we both worked on it equally. And so when we came ready to publish, there was a question of who's going to become the first author. So I said to Joe, well, we know we just toss a coin. So we tossed a coin, and guess what? Joe Brown became first author. So when Lloyd Fisher and I had finished the Biostatistics book, I still remember we were sitting in his driveway just up the hill here and saying, hey, who's going to be the first author? I said, well, why don't we just toss a coin? So we tossed the coin, and sure enough, it came up. Lloyd Fisher became the first author. So this book was known as Fisher and Van Belle for many years. Lloyd was gracious enough when we came with the second edition. It carried the name Van Belle, Fisher, Haggerty, and Lumley. So now I'm the first author on the book. First author, second author is important in academia. It's not that important actually, but it certainly is nice to be recognized. I published a book called Statistical Rules of Thumb in 2003, and that had been a book that's been in my mind for about 10 years. And that book has done very well. So basically it deals with statistical rules of thumb, the idea being that if there are some rules in statistics that would be useful to students in terms of consulting, or perhaps people doing research that involves statistical methods, what are some of the rules that they need to keep in mind? That book has been a Wiley bestseller, and they've actually advertised it as such. And I'm supposed to have a second edition done by the end of this year. Whether that's going to happen or not depends a little bit on how I'm doing on another book, which is on the design of laboratory experiments, which I'm working on currently, which has a deadline of September 1st, and I'm not sure I will make that, but nevertheless, I'm spending a lot of time on that book. And then I'm still involved with lots of other things in terms of serving on external scientific advisory committees. I chair the Institutional Review Board of Group Health, and all these things take time, and they're all fun. They're all very worthwhile, and I certainly get my kick out of them. Looking back, it's sort of interesting to see how the world of statistics has changed. As I mentioned, I did my first statistical work being an assistant to a biostatistician at the University of Toronto named Bill Reed, and I basically was his computer. I computed these assays, and for that I got he got $1,000 to get a calculator, and we had what is called a Frieden calculator, which was basically one of those calculators with a big keyboard, lots of keyboards across, and then you would, it was electric, which was an advantage. I wanted another Frieden, which would also take square roots. He said, well, that costs $2,000, and I just don't have that money. So he gave me the Frieden $1,000 calculator plus Barlow's tables of square roots. He bought me a book which had all the square roots in it, so that if I wanted square roots, I could look them up in the book. But we didn't have enough money to have it be part of the computer, or the calculating machine, as it was called in those days. So I think one of the things that has certainly changed since the early 60s is the whole computing scene. And I think that has, so that's one example of where technique has influenced the substance as well, where technique has changed the kinds of problems that we can deal with, and has enables us to do things today that just weren't easy, that were impossible in the 60s, rather hard to do in the 70s and 80s, and now are just a matter of a push of a button. So the computing power is certainly one thing that has changed dramatically over this time. And of course, again, technology defines the scientific substance as well. So we have the whole issue of gene arrays, where we have 15, 20,000 data points per observation almost, and how do you process that? So that creates a processing problem, and it also creates an interpretation problem in terms of the methodology. What kind of methods do you use for analyzing those kinds of data? So I think that's been one of the major changes that has happened, and that has also allowed us to do things like longitudinal data analysis, which we couldn't have done very well back in the 60s, 70s even. And these things are all in part due to the way that we have increased our computing horsepower. One question that was asked was how did the Department of Biostatistics fit into the School of Public Health? One joke that I've made in the past is that, and you have to know the geography of the school. The Biostatistics department is up on the 6th floor. The Department of Epidemiology is on the 2nd floor. And I used to joke that the real epidemiology was being done on the 6th floor. In point of fact, the methodology for epidemiology came out of the Biostatistics department. So there is a very famous book by Breslow and Day, which is kind of the Bible for epidemiologists. Well, Breslow is a biostatistician. So I think the ability of the biostatistics department to work with the epidemiology department, particularly in cancer research in the 70s, really put this school on the map. And I think that people like Ross Prentice and Art Peterson and John Crowley and all these people really put the school on the map in terms of the cancer area. Tom Fleming coming later on from the Mayo Clinic. And then in cardiology, people like Lloyd Fisher. Lloyd Fisher is a non-physician, yet he was elected a fellow of the American College of Cardiology because he knew enough cardiology that, in fact, he knew so much cardiology that he could become a fellow of the college. That really is an amazing feat. Dick Cronwell, also a very capable person. So those are just two examples where I think that the Biostatistics department set a very high standard in terms of analysis of data, modeling of data, design of experiments, and that just carried through all the way through the school.
Why do you think the School of Public Health and the Department of Biostatistics have achieved such preeminence?
Well, there are about 5 schools of public health in the nation that would be considered in the top 5, and it's a matter of argument which one is number one. I think that the School of Public Health here at the University of Washington is clearly number one in areas such as epidemiology and biostatistics. It's hard to, and I think the Department of Epidemiology is probably the largest department of epidemiology in the world, and biostatistics is almost certainly either the largest or the second largest. And I think that one reason for the size and the impact is that it's been a unique combination of the original leadership and the people that they have recruited. So I think that if I look back and look at the school, there's been very little backbiting. There's been very little infighting. It's not all roses. Don't get me wrong, but I think that on the whole, it's been a very collegial atmosphere, and it's been very collaborative. A lot of emphasis on collaborative research. Nobody sits in their office and shuts the door and does their own thing. People talk with each other. They talk to each other. And I think that that's been one of the great advantages. And of course, it was a young school, so it didn't bring very much baggage. It was formed in 1970, and at the time when funding was reasonably flush, and everybody took advantage of it. And this is the only school north of L.A., basically, and west of University of Minnesota. So this is it covers a vast territory, and it's a great school, and it's been a good place to work. When faculty in this school put their mind to doing something, they produce a superb product, and it really has worked well for the school, and hopefully will work well for the future as well.
Before we wrap this interview, Gerald, please tell us about your teaching and indeed the award you received for your teaching.
In 1985, completely to my surprise, I was told that I had received one of the University of Washington Distinguished Teaching Awards, and nobody told me that they were putting that in. And it's a very prestigious award. In fact, at that time, it came with $3,000, and we bought a piano for that. And my daughter has that piano now. But the person that was primarily responsible for that was Norm Breslow, who really did all the paperwork. Writing one of these recommendations is just a pain in the neck. I've done it for other issues, and it just takes a lot of commitment and time for a person to do that. So I really appreciated Norm's work on that, and of course, once you get that award, it's like an albatross around your neck, because now they tell you when you give a lecture, well, so-and-so won the Distinguished Teaching Award, and if you give just a humdrum lecture, they say, why did he get that award? So it's kind of, like the Nobel Prize is sort of downhill ever after. And in point of fact, I actually had some classes where the students were so upset with the class that they went and talked with the chair to complain about my teaching. So it doesn't mean that a good teacher is always a good teacher. It really is a matter of finding the right subject and the right students and the right person. And when that chemistry is right, it can be very powerful. But if it's not right, then all hell breaks loose at times. And so I've had my shares of pluses and minuses when it comes to teaching. But I've enjoyed teaching. I think I'm a reasonably good teacher. I enjoy communicating. Teaching is a fun occupation, and you always learn something. You always find out there's some student is going to ask you something, then there's a paper in there, a question almost, because they ask you something that they haven't thought through, but you haven't thought it through either. And it's worthwhile sometimes to think that through and then come up with some ideas. So teaching is a great profession, and being a faculty member is a great profession.